Zuri had always known that her life belonged to others long before she understood the full weight of that truth. In the village where she was born, every action, thought, and decision of a young woman was scrutinized, monitored, and predetermined by those who claimed to know what was best. Families and elders dictated every step: when she should wake, what she should eat, how she should speak, who she could befriend, and ultimately whom she would marry. The world around her was tightly bounded, a cage invisible but unyielding, built brick by brick through tradition, expectation, and fear. Zuri's home, though warm in the surface ways of provision, was filled with constant reminders of what she was expected to become: obedient, compliant, and invisible in her own desires. Every glance, gesture, and whispered admonition was a subtle force shaping her into the version of herself that the elders demanded. Yet Zuri was not like the other girls. Quiet as she appeared, she carried a mind sharp as the edge of a knife and an understanding of people that belied her age. She observed everything with careful attention: the way elders communicated without speaking, the way her cousins followed instructions with blind compliance, and the way the villagers whispered about the importance of keeping women in their place. She had learned to listen not only to words but to silences, to read the tension behind a smile and the intentions behind every gesture. While outwardly she nodded, laughed when expected, and bowed to authority, inwardly her spirit remained untamed, quietly building a reservoir of knowledge, observation, and subtle defiance. Life under constant restriction was exhausting, but Zuri found ways to preserve her sense of self. She moved silently through the village paths, memorizing shortcuts and hidden spaces where no one would see her pause, breathe, or simply exist. In the early mornings before anyone stirred, she would sit by the river and let her thoughts wander, imagining worlds beyond the imposed limitations, tracing possibilities for herself that no one could dictate. She wrote mental notes about the patterns of authority, the predictable weaknesses in her family's insistence on control, and the hidden cracks in the elders' strategies for obedience. Each day, she stored away knowledge like precious stones, knowing that one day it might serve her in ways no one could anticipate. Her intelligence, however, was never meant to be acknowledged. Village life insisted that young women appear compliant, cheerful, and subservient. Complaints about injustice were dismissed as foolishness, ideas about freedom were ridiculed as childish, and any hint of ambition was met with sharp rebukes or social censure. Zuri navigated these pressures with the poise of someone playing a long game. She smiled when scolded, agreed when commanded, and appeared meek when observed, all while her mind quietly plotted, calculated, and memorized. Her defiance was not loud or aggressive. It was internal, a quiet rebellion that grew stronger with each restriction placed upon her. Even among family members, control was asserted subtly but powerfully. Her father, proud of his adherence to tradition, reminded her constantly that obedience was the only virtue a woman needed. Her mother, worn by years of compliance herself, repeated the lessons of caution and patience, teaching Zuri to accept the limits placed upon her as natural law. Cousins and neighbors reinforced the hierarchy in small but unrelenting ways, through comments, comparisons, and gentle but constant social pressure. Yet, for every attempt to shape her outwardly, Zuri's inner strength grew in opposition. She memorized every instruction, every expectation, and every restriction, not to comply blindly, but to understand the system she might one day navigate or dismantle on her own terms. Despite appearances, Zuri was never broken. Her spirit remained resilient, and her mind sharp and observant. She lived in a delicate balance, outwardly compliant yet inwardly sovereign. The village believed they controlled her fate completely, but Zuri's quiet defiance, her hidden intelligence, and her ability to observe and understand the world around her made it clear that she was far from powerless. Every glance she gave, every thought she nurtured, and every small act of silent rebellion were seeds of a future the village could not foresee, a future where one choice might unravel the very chains they had built to contain her. The morning sunlight barely touched Zuri's face before the elders and her guardians began their daily reminders of what was expected of her. Today, as so many days before, the topic was her future, a future already chosen for her by those who claimed to know better. "You will marry Oba," her father said, his voice firm yet calm, as if the statement itself contained no room for debate. "He is suitable, respected, and your life will be secure in his hands. This is what is best for you." Her mother nodded in agreement, adding gentle warnings about obedience and the dangers of disobedience. To them, there was no question, no need for discussion, because the path had already been decided. The villagers, ever watchful, reinforced this control. Neighbors would stop by casually, dropping remarks like, "It is best to follow what the elders say. Young women who question their guardians only bring trouble." Gossip spread swiftly. A cousin's hesitation, a friend's curiosity, even a stranger's glance became fodder for communal pressure. Zuri could feel the weight of every judgment, every whispered expectation, pressing down upon her. Compliance was not optional, and deviation was unthinkable. The social web that held her in place was invisible yet suffocating, binding her every action to a path she had not chosen. As she listened, Zuri felt the tightening of her chest, the familiar squeeze of trapped potential. Her heart and mind, full of ideas, curiosity, and longing, were constrained by the rigid rules imposed on her. Every instruction, every warning, every pointed glance reminded her of her limited agency. She was expected to bow, to smile politely, to accept the path chosen for her without hesitation, as if her desires and thoughts were irrelevant. The life designed for her was predictable, safe for those in authority, but stifling for a mind as vibrant and sharp as hers. Yet, as the pressure mounted, so did Zuri's resolve. She began to think in secret, mapping possibilities that no one else could see. If her guardians insisted she marry Oba and follow their rules, then she would learn everything about him, about the village, and about the systems that controlled her. Every conversation became an observation, every action a clue, and every restriction an opportunity to plan. She memorized schedules, routines, and weaknesses. She noted who relied on whom, who could be persuaded, and where small openings existed in the otherwise airtight control imposed by her family and the elders. These thoughts were private, hidden beneath polite smiles and nods. No one suspected the depth of her observation, the careful way she catalogued information in her mind. While outwardly compliant, she mentally sketched routes of escape, strategies of defiance, and ways to reclaim her autonomy. The whispers of the villagers, the lectures of the elders, the warnings of her guardians, all of it fed her understanding of the power structure she would one day confront. Though trapped on the surface, Zuri's mind was free. Every imposed decision, every directive, became a puzzle she intended to solve. She learned patience, timing, and subtlety. Each expectation forced upon her strengthened her determination not to be a mere subject of someone else's will. Beneath the veneer of obedience, a quiet storm brewed, a storm of thought, calculation, and courage that would one day erupt into a decisive act. She was preparing, quietly and meticulously, for the moment when one choice could unravel the very fate they believed they had set for her. Zuri's life under constant surveillance had taught her that strength did not always roar. It often whispered, lingered unseen, and grew quietly in the spaces others overlooked. Every rule she followed, every expectation she outwardly complied with, became a lesson in patience, observation, and strategy. She began to notice subtleties that no one else considered: the hesitation in a neighbor's voice when repeating the elder's commands, the fleeting glances of women who carried quiet dissatisfaction, the cracks in the authority that seemed absolute. These small details were treasures to Zuri, clues about human behavior and vulnerabilities in the system that constrained her. She realized that direct confrontation would be fatal, that rebellion shouted from the rooftops would be crushed before it began. Instead, she cultivated what she called her hidden resolve, an inner strength that no one could detect. Each day she practiced small acts of mental resistance, affirming to herself that her mind and choices were still her own. She repeated in silence that her life belonged to no one but herself and that one day, the unseen power she carried within would manifest in ways that could not be ignored. As she walked through the village, Zuri began to find allies in unexpected places. Elderly women who had long suffered under the same rigid rules and who recognized the spark in her eyes, offered subtle encouragement through kind words or small gestures. Children who had been quiet observers, sometimes mimicked her tiny acts of defiance, such as lingering a moment too long in the sun, asking questions softly, or looking directly into the faces of adults who expected submission. Even a few young men, quietly empathetic and aware of the injustices around them, gave her silent support, offering information, warning her of surveillance, or creating small diversions when necessary. These alliances, delicate and hidden, were invisible to the village at large but became a network that strengthened her resolve. Zuri also experimented with subtle acts of defiance. She learned to delay compliance, answering commands with polite hesitation that raised no suspicion but bought her time. She questioned instructions in ways that seemed innocent, as if merely curious, yet planted seeds of doubt in those enforcing the rules. She practiced moving in ways that appeared obedient while secretly testing boundaries, learning which restrictions could be bent without drawing attention. These small acts, almost imperceptible, became exercises in control over her own life, each one building her confidence and skill in navigating the oppressive system. Her mind was constantly at work, cataloging every interaction, every instruction, every expectation, and every opportunity. Zuri began to understand the patterns of authority, the dependencies of those around her, and the hidden motivations that kept the village in a state of quiet obedience. She noticed that fear, habit, and pride were stronger than any physical barrier. By observing these forces, she discovered ways to use them subtly to her advantage, planning strategies that would one day allow her to act decisively without being crushed by retaliation. The beauty of her hidden resolve lay in its invisibility. No one suspected that beneath her calm demeanor and obedient exterior, a mind of extraordinary cunning and courage was at work. Each day of compliance was a day of preparation. Each act of observation was a brick in the foundation of her ultimate choice. Zuri understood that power did not always need to announce itself. It could grow silently, steadily, and strategically. She had become a master of patience, of quiet rebellion, and of inner fortitude, knowing that the moment to assert her autonomy would arrive, and when it did, it would be unstoppable. By the end of these months of careful observation and subtle resistance, Zuri was no longer merely a girl constrained by authority. She had transformed into a strategist, a quiet force of intelligence and courage. Her hidden resolve was a living thing, strengthening with every day, preparing her for the one act that would finally unravel the fate they thought they controlled. Zuri had long understood that patience alone would not grant her freedom. Quiet defiance and subtle resistance were powerful, but to truly reclaim her life she needed a plan, one precise, calculated, and executed with flawless timing. In the stillness of her room, often after the village had gone to sleep, she pored over every detail she had observed, every weakness she had noticed in those who sought to control her. Each step of her secret plan was shaped by intelligence, strategy, and an acute understanding of human behavior. She began by mapping the dependencies of her family and the elders. She noted who relied on whom for decisions, resources, and social influence. The elders, who presented an image of unassailable authority, had fragile networks of power. Their influence depended on fear, tradition, and the unquestioned obedience of those around them. Zuri recorded these observations mentally, understanding that the collapse of one small part of this system could create ripple effects far larger than anyone anticipated. Her family, too, had weaknesses. Her father's pride made him predictable. His insistence on maintaining appearances often blinded him to subtle disruptions. Her mother, though cautious, feared social judgment and could be swayed by threats to reputation or reminders of moral obligations. Zuri cataloged every habit, every reaction, every predictable flaw, turning the knowledge into tools for the decisive moment she had envisioned. In addition to mapping weaknesses, Zuri began gathering tangible information. She memorized schedules, routines, and interactions. She noted when villagers and elders would be distracted, when doors were left unattended, and when supervision was lax. Every seemingly trivial detail, when the market was busiest, which neighbors were sympathetic, the patterns of guards or watchers, was a piece of the puzzle. Her mind worked like a meticulous cartographer, drawing invisible maps that only she could read, guiding her toward freedom. All the while, Zuri cultivated a network of quiet allies. The elderly women who admired her intelligence offered subtle advice and guidance, sharing knowledge about the village's hidden customs and secret pathways. The few young men who supported her provided silent warnings or created minor distractions when necessary. Children, too, became unwitting collaborators, their innocent observations serving as additional eyes and ears. Together, these small forces strengthened the foundation of her plan, though no one suspected the magnitude of her intentions. Her planning was meticulous, with contingencies for every likely scenario. She imagined the reactions of the elders, anticipated the objections of her family, and calculated the best timing to act. Every move was layered with subtlety, designed to minimize risk while maximizing impact. Zuri's intelligence and resourcefulness shone through her careful preparations, transforming what seemed impossible into a plausible path toward autonomy. By the time she was ready to act, Zuri's plan was more than a series of steps. It was a masterwork of strategy, patience, and foresight. Every detail, every observation, every subtle alliance she had cultivated converged toward the one decisive moment when she would reclaim control over her life. Though outwardly she remained calm and obedient, beneath the surface a storm of intelligence and courage. The sun rose over the village with a sense of inevitability, casting golden light over paths that Zuri had walked countless times, yet today they felt different. Today was the day the world expected her to follow the path carved by others, the day she was to obey without question, to become the version of herself chosen by her family and the elders. Yet, beneath the calm exterior she displayed to all, her mind raced with careful calculations, courage, and anticipation. Every moment of preparation, every quiet act of resistance, and every subtle observation had led to this singular point. From the moment she stepped outside, the air seemed charged with expectation. Villagers gathered naturally, their curiosity tinged with certainty. They had watched her for years, observing her obedience and her compliance, and they assumed that today would be no different. Mothers whispered to their children, elders adjusted their robes with an air of confidence, and men exchanged knowing nods. All eyes were on her, convinced that Zuri would walk the path laid out for her without deviation. Yet in her chest, a storm brewed, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and unshakable resolve. Her guardians approached, their expressions composed, betraying nothing of the tension they themselves felt. "Today you will do what has been decided," her father said, his tone firm but measured. "There is no other path for you. Obedience is your duty." Her mother nodded silently beside him, reinforcing the certainty of their authority. But Zuri did not waver. She gave them the polite nod expected of her, the smile of compliance they assumed she had always worn, and yet, in her mind, the intricate mechanisms of her plan began to unfold. Every step she took, every glance exchanged, and every gesture was calculated. The villagers believed they were witnessing submission, but Zuri was orchestrating a quiet symphony of defiance. She knew where the eyes were when the attention would waver, and how small distractions could be leveraged. Children played subtly at the edges of the crowd, oblivious to the critical role they would play in her maneuver. Elderly allies, unseen by most, watched carefully, ready to offer guidance or aid if necessary. Every piece of her network, every observation she had made over months, was in motion, ready to converge at the decisive instant. As the ceremony to affirm her obedience began, the pressure intensified. Elders recited traditional blessings, neighbors whispered approval, and the air thickened with expectation. Zuri's heart raced, but she controlled it, focusing on timing, rhythm, and awareness. She imagined every reaction, anticipated every argument, and held in her mind the exact sequence of actions that would assert her autonomy without immediate failure. Her fingers twitched slightly, her mind mapping routes, exits, and contingencies. The villagers, unaware, assumed she was merely fidgeting under the weight of social pressure. Inside, Zuri struggled to contain the swirling emotions, fear of punishment, uncertainty about outcomes, the weight of years under control, but these emotions fueled her clarity rather than diminishing it. Her clever strategies, honed in secret, now became her shield and sword. With every measured breath, she aligned her intention, the subtle allies positioned themselves, and the moment approached when her choice would redefine the course of her life. Finally, the crucial instant arrived. Zuri took a step that seemed ordinary but carried the force of months of planning, intelligence, and courage. Every eye followed, every whisper of anticipation trembled in the air, and for the first time, the village sensed that the outcome might not be what they had assumed. Her choice, once executed, would not merely assert her autonomy, it would begin to unravel the carefully constructed expectations and controls that had bound her for so long. In that moment, Zuri became more than a girl constrained by authority. She became a force of inevitability, a reminder that intelligence, courage, and preparation could bend fate itself. The moment arrived with the weight of inevitability, yet with a tension so sharp it seemed to slice through the thick morning air. Zuri's heart beat steadily, a rhythm honed through months of observation, patience, and quiet preparation. All around her, villagers and elders assumed they had rehearsed this day countless times in their minds, convinced that she would obey without question. Every expectation, every whispered prediction, every nod of approval or subtle warning had been made with the assumption that Zuri's compliance was a certainty. They were wrong. With a calmness that belied the storm within, Zuri moved in a way no one could have predicted. Her steps were deliberate, each one measured to convey compliance, yet each one executed to initiate a disruption no one saw coming. In the midst of the ritual that would cement her submission, she executed a carefully orchestrated series of actions designed to unravel the authority of those controlling her life. Her decision was not loud, not chaotic, but precise, intelligent, and unyielding. It was a choice born of courage, strategy, and an understanding of the hidden weaknesses in the systems built to constrain her. Immediately, the effects were subtle yet undeniable. Elders froze, caught off guard by a move they had never anticipated. Their carefully rehearsed plans faltered, their confidence cracking under the pressure of an unforeseen challenge. Conversations halted, gestures paused midair, and the villagers' collective gaze followed her every motion, sensing, without fully understanding that the equilibrium they had relied upon for years had been disturbed. Zuri's action was like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples across every carefully constructed boundary of control. What had once been hidden manipulation and subtle coercion began to unravel in front of everyone. Lies that had been told to justify restrictions were exposed through small but undeniable contradictions. Promises made to secure obedience revealed themselves as empty, and manipulations meant to shape behavior became visible as shallow and fragile. Those who had assumed dominance over Zuri realized that their authority was contingent on perception, not power. With each passing moment, the ripple of her bold choice grew stronger, reaching further into the village than even she had imagined. The villagers, initially stunned, began to recognize the courage behind her action. Some whispered to neighbors, questioning the fairness of the rules, the morality of obedience without consent, and the injustices that had long been ignored. Others looked at her with fear, suddenly aware that the control they had taken for granted was far more fragile than they believed. Even those closest to her, who had imposed restrictions under the guise of protection, felt the pressure of accountability pressing down upon them. Zuri's choice illuminated the hidden truths that had long been suppressed, revealing that obedience was not inevitable, and that courage could fracture even the most entrenched authority. Despite the chaos and confusion she created, Zuri remained composed. Her intelligence guided her movements, her understanding of human nature allowed her to anticipate reactions, and her inner strength shielded her from the panic that rippled through the crowd. She knew that this bold choice, though daring and disruptive, was necessary not just for herself, but for the village that had long existed under fear and rigid control. Each step she took, each gesture she made, reinforced her autonomy while simultaneously destabilizing the structures of dominance around her. By the time the day reached its peak, Zuri's action had sparked a transformation. The elders' authority, once unquestionable, had been undermined. Lies and manipulations lay exposed, and the village began to glimpse a new reality, one where control was no longer absolute and courage could inspire change. Zuri's choice had done more than reclaim her freedom. It had set in motion a chain of events that challenged tradition, disrupted false power, and ignited a spark of awakening in the hearts of those who had believed her fate was sealed. She had chosen, and in choosing she had begun to rewrite the story of her life, and the story of her village. The aftermath of Zuri's decisive action unfolded like the slow lifting of a heavy, suffocating fog. At first, the villagers were stunned, caught between disbelief and awe, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Her choice, seemingly simple in execution, had unleashed consequences far beyond what anyone anticipated. The control that had once seemed unshakable was now fragile, brittle under the weight of truth, and Zuri's presence acted as a prism, refracting hidden realities for all to see. Those who had sought to dictate her life, the elders, her guardians and influential figures in the village, found themselves exposed. Small lies, once carefully concealed, became glaringly obvious. Decisions made in secret, manipulations designed to maintain power, and betrayals disguised as guidance now appeared in their full, unvarnished form. Her father, proud and commanding, could no longer hide the favoritism and manipulations he had employed to shape her destiny. The elders' strict rules and rigid enforcement, once regarded as unquestionable tradition, revealed themselves as instruments of fear and control. Even the neighbors, who had whispered and gossiped for years, began to understand the depth of their complicity. They had upheld and reinforced the authority of those in power, remaining silent when injustice occurred, and ignoring the subtle cruelty that constrained Zuri's life. Now, confronted with her bold defiance, they were forced to reckon with their own role in sustaining a system designed to suppress choice and enforce obedience. Murmurs spread through the village. We believed we were protecting tradition, but perhaps we were blind. The ripple of recognition grew, sparking conversations that had been forbidden or feared. Corruption and selfishness that had been masked as moral authority could no longer hide. Elders who had accepted bribes to enforce decisions, families who had manipulated social customs for personal gain, and those who had silenced dissent, all were revealed. Zuri's single act of courage illuminated these truths, demonstrating that a system built on control could not withstand transparency. Each revelation shook the village's foundations, forcing people to confront realities they had chosen to ignore, and showing them that obedience alone did not guarantee morality or justice. Yet Zuri herself remained composed, watching as the village struggled to process the unraveling of authority. She understood that exposure alone was not enough. The lessons had to sink in, the recognition of injustice had to take root. Her intelligence and patience, honed over years of silent observation, allowed her to anticipate the wave of denial, fear, and rationalization that would inevitably follow. She let the consequences unfold naturally, giving the villagers space to wrestle with their guilt, their complacency, and the truths they had ignored. Children and quietly observant villagers began to notice the cracks in power. They saw that authority was fallible, that obedience could be questioned, and that courage, thought to be dangerous or rebellious, was actually a catalyst for clarity and justice. Discussions that had been whispered in secret became open debates, and the village slowly began to reckon with the lessons hidden in Zuri's defiance. Her action had not only freed her, it had opened eyes, shifted perceptions, and exposed the hidden architecture of control that had constrained everyone. By the end of the day, the village was changed. Secrets long buried were now in plain sight, accountability could no longer be avoided, and the culture of unquestioned obedience was destabilized. Zuri's choice had proven that even in a community built on strict hierarchy and rigid control, a single act of intelligence, courage, and autonomy could unravel the systems of dominance, revealing the truth and awakening the collective conscience. The power of her decision echoed far beyond herself, leaving an indelible mark on the hearts and minds of all who had sought to control her. The consequences of Zuri's choice did not remain confined to her own life. They rippled outward, touching every corner of the village with the intensity of a shockwave. At first, the disruption was subtle, a hesitating word here, a questioning glance there, but it quickly escalated into a palpable tension that pulsed through the streets, homes, and gathering places. People who had long relied on routine, obedience, and unquestioned authority found themselves unsure, unsettled, and fearful. The structures that had maintained control for generations were trembling under the weight of one young woman's audacity. Elders, who had prided themselves on infallibility, were the first to feel the pressure. Their gestures of command faltered. Instructions meant to enforce order were met with hesitation, skepticism, or outright questioning. Those who had previously obeyed without pause now whispered to one another, sharing doubts that had long been buried beneath fear and tradition. The village square, usually a place of compliance and ceremony, became a stage for uncertainty. Even the most loyal supporters of the elders hesitated, uncertain whether to maintain allegiance or align with the shifting tide that Zuri had set in motion. Panic spread among those whose influence depended entirely on perception. Wealthy families who had used status and social pressure to control behavior suddenly felt exposed. Decisions that had been justified through appearances and tradition were now seen as manipulative, unfair, or petty. The gossip network, which had long reinforced obedience, fractured as conflicting narratives emerged. Children who had never questioned authority now whispered, laughed, and asked questions in public, their curiosity emboldened by the unraveling of rigid expectations. Zuri watched all of this unfold with the careful precision of a strategist. She did not rush forward to assert dominance or correct mistakes. Instead, she allowed the chaos to play out, using her understanding of human behavior to anticipate reactions and guide outcomes invisibly. Every panic-stricken glance, every hesitant step, every whispered conversation was part of a larger mosaic that she had observed for months. By remaining calm and deliberate, she ensured that the shockwave would dismantle the village's rigid hierarchy without creating irreversible harm, giving the community a chance to see the truth clearly and internalize the lessons her choice had set in motion. Voices that had been suppressed for decades began to rise. Women who had long been silenced spoke in quiet yet firm tones, questioning rules that had been enforced in the name of tradition. Young men who had once followed instructions unquestioningly now offered counsel and debated openly, challenging authority where previously they had submitted. Even elders who were sympathetic to the old ways began to reconsider their positions, recognizing the fragility of control and the need to reconcile with fairness, empathy, and truth. As fear and confusion mingled with realization, the village experienced a transformation of perception. People who had accepted obedience as the natural order began to understand that power could be questioned, that injustice could be exposed, and that change was possible. The shockwave Zuri had initiated was more than disruption. It was an awakening. Every ripple carried a lesson, every reaction exposed hidden truths, and every hesitant voice contributed to a collective reckoning. By the end of the day, the village had changed irreversibly. The panic of uncertainty had given way to curiosity and reflection. Zuri's strategic patience ensured that the chaos served a purpose, revealing weaknesses, amplifying suppressed voices, and dismantling false authority. Her foresight guided the village like an unseen hand, proving that power could be exercised without force, influence without intimidation, and strategy without direct confrontation. In the aftermath, it was clear that one well-calculated choice, executed with intelligence and courage, could create a shockwave that transformed an entire community, leaving an imprint that would be felt for generations. As the shockwave of Zuri's decisive action rippled through the village, it became clear that the disruption of authority had created space for others to step forward. Quiet observers who had long admired Zuri's intelligence and subtle defiance realized that their chance to act had finally arrived. No longer constrained by fear or rigid social expectations, they began to rise, forming a network of allies who shared her vision of justice, fairness, and autonomy. Their courage, inspired by Zuri's, became a beacon for those who had long suffered in silence. These allies were diverse. Some were women who had endured decades of control and suppression, now emboldened to speak openly, advocate for themselves, and challenge the unfair restrictions imposed by tradition. Others were young men who had observed the injustices quietly, now ready to support change by offering protection, sharing knowledge, or questioning outdated rules. Even older villagers who had been overlooked or forgotten joined in, lending wisdom, guidance, and credibility to the movement that Zuri's single act had ignited. Together, this growing coalition began to take action. They helped the vulnerable members of the village, those previously silenced, overlooked, or marginalized, find their voices. Children who had never been permitted to question authority were encouraged to speak freely and share observations about the unfair treatment around them. Families torn apart by obedience to oppressive traditions were given support to rebuild trust and reconnect with one another. Slowly, the village began to shift from a place of fear and compliance to one of dialogue, understanding, and shared responsibility. The allies also reinforced the lesson Zuri had taught: courage and intelligence, when exercised strategically, could reshape power dynamics. They served as living examples of resistance and wisdom, showing others that challenging the old systems did not lead to chaos but to growth and equity. Through their actions, the village learned that authority could coexist with compassion, that respect was more powerful than fear, and that collective courage could achieve what submission alone never could. Zuri observed these developments quietly, as she always had, her strategic foresight ensuring that the village's transformation unfolded smoothly. She recognized that real change required more than the exposure of weakness or the disruption of control. It required guidance, encouragement, and tangible support. By stepping back and allowing her allies to act, she ensured that the new order of the village was rooted in collaboration rather than dominance, empathy rather than fear. By the day's end, the seeds Zuri had planted through years of observation, patience, and subtle defiance had blossomed into action. Allies had risen, the vulnerable had been supported, and the villagers who had once been passive participants in oppression were now active contributors to a new, fairer community. Zuri's choice had sparked not only her own liberation but a collective awakening, proving that courage, when combined with strategy and intelligence, could empower others to step forward, reshape systems, and create lasting change. The day of reckoning arrived quietly at first, like the low hum of a drum heralding an inevitable storm. Villagers gathered in the central square, a mix of curiosity, tension, and apprehension in the air. Those who had once sought to dominate Zuri, confident in their power and influence, now felt the weight of exposure pressing down upon them. Faces that had worn authority like armor began to pale with uncertainty, their once unquestioned control unraveling under the gaze of a community awakened. Zuri stood at the periphery, composed yet fully aware of every glance, every whispered speculation. Her calm presence contrasted sharply with the unease rippling through the crowd. The elders, who had enforced strict rules and demanded obedience, were first to confront the consequences. Their misdeeds, favoritism, manipulations, and the suppression of dissent were no longer hidden behind ritual or reputation. Accusations, once unspoken, were now voiced openly by villagers emboldened by Zuri's defiance. Each revelation chipped away at the pillars of authority, exposing the truth that had long been denied. Her father, whose pride had guided every command and every attempt to control her choices, felt the full force of judgment. The villagers questioned his motives, recalling how his insistence on obedience had ignored Zuri's intelligence, insight, and right to autonomy. His arguments faltered, his defenses weakened, as the community collectively confronted the harm his authority had caused. Even those who had quietly supported him began to reconsider their positions, their previous complicity weighing heavily on their conscience. The reckoning extended beyond the elders and Zuri's immediate family. Villagers who had upheld the system through gossip, silent compliance, or fear now faced scrutiny. The truth of their complicity became undeniable as conversations spread, exposing patterns of obedience that perpetuated injustice. Children who had observed in silence, adults who had turned a blind eye, and neighbors who had prioritized social conformity over fairness all confronted the reality that their inaction had enabled harm. Zuri's courage had revealed not just the faults of authority but the hidden complicity of the community as a whole. Amid this confrontation, Zuri remained a figure of strength and wisdom. Her actions had been calculated, her strategy precise, and her patience unwavering. As villagers expressed their outrage, shame, and in some cases genuine remorse, Zuri's presence grounded the proceedings. She did not need to assert dominance. Her intellect and courage had already dismantled the structures that sought to constrain her. Through observation, planning, and subtle defiance, she had shifted the balance of power and established herself as a guiding force for justice and fairness. The outcome was transformative. The elders' influence, though respected for tradition, was now tempered by accountability. Families reassessed their roles in maintaining unjust control, and the village collectively learned the value of discernment, empathy, and critical thought. Zuri's decision had not only liberated herself but had created a precedent. Obedience to authority without conscience was no longer acceptable, and courage paired with intelligence could inspire systemic change. By the day's end, the reckoning had established a new order. Those who had sought to dominate Zuri faced justice in the form of public scrutiny, shame, and communal reflection. The villagers, having confronted their own complicity, emerged more aware, more conscious, and more accountable. Zuri's choice, once doubted and dismissed, was vindicated spectacularly, and she became not only a figure of strength and wisdom but also a symbol of what could be achieved when one dared to act decisively against injustice. Her legacy, rooted in courage, intelligence, and foresight, would shape the village for generations to come. The days following the reckoning were quiet yet charged with transformation. The village, still absorbing the shockwaves of Zuri's decisive actions, began to adapt to a new understanding of authority, choice, and fairness. Conversations that had once been taboo, about personal autonomy, ethical leadership, and the right to self-determination, now flowed openly. Elders and villagers alike grappled with the realization that the old systems of control had been built on fear, not respect, and that true strength lay in empowering others rather than enforcing obedience. Children, who had often observed life under rigid expectations, were the first to sense the shift. Girls who had long been taught that compliance was their greatest virtue now saw a different model in Zuri. Courage paired with intelligence, patience combined with strategy. Boys, too, began questioning assumptions, realizing that authority must be balanced with empathy, and that leadership meant responsibility, not domination. In the marketplaces, around the wells, and at the edges of gathering spaces, whispers of Zuri's bravery circulated, turning her single act of defiance into lessons in courage and wisdom for the youngest members of the community. Young women found in Zuri a tangible example of empowerment. Her story inspired them to voice opinions, negotiate decisions, and pursue paths that had previously been restricted. The lessons she demonstrated were subtle but powerful. Autonomy was not rebellion, intelligence could guide courage, and resistance could be both strategic and effective. Families began to notice the change as girls expressed ideas more confidently, proposed solutions to village problems, and challenged unfair expectations in ways that were thoughtful and respectful. Each instance reinforced the idea that Zuri's choice had not just freed herself, it had ignited a ripple of awakening across generations. Cultural norms, once rigid and unquestioned, began to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. Rituals, rules, and social expectations were re-evaluated with newfound clarity. Practices that had been enforced out of habit or fear were examined for fairness and practicality. Elders and families engaged in dialogue about the balance between tradition and justice, learning that cultural continuity need not come at the cost of individual freedom. Zuri's defiance became a story told at gatherings, over fires, and in quiet conversations, a cautionary tale for those tempted to impose authority without conscience, and a beacon for those seeking to act with courage and discernment. Even those who had opposed her initially began to internalize the lessons she had imparted. The shame of their complicity, tempered by the visible benefits of change, encouraged reflection and behavioral adjustments. Decisions about marriage, work, and movement became less about strict enforcement and more about negotiation, mutual respect, and recognition of individual capabilities. The village gradually fostered an environment where people could exercise choice responsibly, challenge unfair practices, and embrace empathy as a guiding principle. By the end of this period of adaptation, the village had become a different place. Zuri's actions had done more than disrupt control. They had laid the foundation for a community where fairness, respect, and autonomy were celebrated rather than suppressed. Her story circulated widely, becoming both a lesson and an inspiration. Children and young women carried her example forward, ensuring that the ripple of change she had created would endure. Zuri had shown that a single courageous choice, grounded in intelligence and patience, could reshape a community, redefining its values, its norms and its vision for the future.